They called her the Shadow. For 6 months, Alara Evans had haunted the halls of Northgate Regional Hospital's emergency department, a whisper in scrubs a size too big, her presence as faint as the antiseptic smell that never quite left the air. She did the menial tasks, stocking carts, cleaning bedpans, taking vitals, and endured the casual cruelty of the department's reigning monarch, Dr. Adrian Vance. They didn't know that the slight tremor in her hands, the one Dr. Vance loved to mock, wasn't from fear, but from the memory of holding a comrade's life together with nothing but pressure and prayer. They didn't expect the quiet student nurse, the one who never made eye contact, was about to become the only thing standing between the ER and total collapse. Alara Evans wasn't a timid trainee learning the ropes. Alara Evans was a ghost, a legend from a world of sand and steel they couldn't possibly comprehend, and the time for shadows was coming to an end. The ER hummed its usual chaotic tune, a symphony of beeping monitors, rattling gurneys, and the low moans of the afflicted. It was a Tuesday night, which meant Dr. Vance was in his element, holding court in the center of the nurses' station like a peacock displaying his feathers. He was handsome in a cruel manufactured way, with teeth too white and a Rolex that cost more than Alara's entire nursing school tuition. His charisma was a weapon, sharp and effective, used to charm administrators and flay the confidence of anyone he deemed beneath him. Today, his target was Alara. "Evans!" he barked, not bothering to look up from the chart he was pretending to read. The sound of her name, sharp and dismissive, made her flinch. It was a conditioned response, one she hated. "This coffee tastes like battery acid. Did you brew it with a patient's urine sample?" A few of the sycophantic junior residents snickered. Alara kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the scuffed toes of her comfortable, ugly shoes. "No, sir, it's the standard hospital blend." Her voice was a low rasp, a defense mechanism she'd perfected. The less you were heard, the less you were noticed. "The standard hospital blend is an insult to the very concept of coffee," Vance declared, pushing the mug away with theatrical disgust. It sloshed over the side, a brown wave that crept across the counter toward her paperwork. "Get me a real coffee, from the barista place downstairs, a double-shot macchiato extra dry, and be quick about it. Some of us have actual work to do." He tossed a crumpled $5 bill onto the counter. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. The gesture was the point. "Yes, sir," she murmured, gathering the bill. Her fingers brushed against the damp counter. The smell of stale coffee filled her nostrils, mingling with the ever-present scent of bleach and sickness. She turned to leave, her movements deliberate and slow, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the ER. Every step was a negotiation with the ghost of an injury in her right leg, a dull ache that sharpened with the damp weather. The rain had started an hour ago, a soft patter that was now growing into a steady, percussive drumming against the large windows of the waiting area. A storm was coming. The air felt heavy with it, thick and electric. As she passed Trauma Bay 3, she saw a young boy, maybe 8 years old, crying while a nurse tried to set an IV. His arm was clearly broken, an angry, swollen mess. Dr. Vance had glanced at the X-ray for less than 3 seconds before ordering a standard cast and a dose of pediatric morphine. "Simple transverse fracture of the radius," he'd announced to the room. "Even a student nurse could handle it." But Alara had seen the X-ray over the resident's shoulder. It wasn't simple. There was a faint, spiderweb-thin fracture line extending toward the growth plate. A green stick fracture maybe, but complicated. If it wasn't set with absolute precision, the boy's arm could grow crooked, a lifelong reminder of one doctor's arrogance. She paused, her hand hovering near the doorframe. She should say something. The protocol, the ethics, her own buried conscience demanded it. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, a memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. The blinding light of a flare over a desert valley, the scream of a man she'd called brother, the feel of shattered bone under her fingertips. Her own voice then had not been a whisper. It had been a roar, a command, a promise. "Stay with me, Sergeant. You are not dying in this dust." The memory faded, leaving the taste of ash in her mouth. She looked at Dr. Vance, now laughing with a pretty pharmacist, his perfect teeth flashing under the fluorescent lights. What would he do if she, the shadow, contradicted him? He would humiliate her. He would have her written up, maybe even expelled from the student program. He held all the power, and she, for reasons she had to constantly remind herself of, needed to remain invisible. She was here to heal in a different way, to find peace in quiet service, to prove to herself that her hands could still fix things without being covered in sand and blood. She turned away from the trauma bay, the boy's quiet sobs following her down the hall. The $5 bill felt slick and dirty in her palm. Justice was a luxury, and she was just a ghost, drifting through a world that had forgotten she ever existed. She pushed through the double doors, the humid night air and the sound of the growing storm, a welcome shock to her system. The walk to the coffee shop would be slow. She would let the rain soak the thin fabric of her scrubs. For a moment, it might wash away the feeling of cowardice that clung to her like the smell of antiseptic. But she knew it wouldn't. It was a stain that went bone deep. The coffee shop was an oasis of warm light and the rich, earthy smell of roasted beans. Elara ordered the ridiculously complex drink, paid the difference from her own pocket, and waited. Through the shop window, she watched the rain fall in silver sheets, blurring the streetlights into hazy constellations. An ambulance, its lights flashing but sirens silent, pulled up to the ER entrance. Routine. A drunk driver, a heart attack, the Tuesday night regulars. She remembered another kind of arrival. The thud, thud, thud of a Black Hawk landing hard, kicking up a storm of dust and pebbles. The controlled chaos of the Casevac team. The faces of the medics, grim and set, as they received the wounded. They worked with a silent, brutal efficiency that was both terrifying and beautiful. There was no ego, no grandstanding. There was only the mission. Save the life. Then the next one. Then the next one. She picked up the cup, the heat a small comfort against her cold hands. As she walked back, she rehearsed the apology for taking too long. She would be quiet, deferential. She would absorb the insults. She would be the shadow. That was the plan. Survive the shift. Survive the program. Find a quiet corner of the world where no one screamed and nothing ever exploded. But as she re-entered the ER, the air had changed. The steady hum was gone, replaced by a frantic, high-pitched tension. More staff were running now. A senior nurse, Maria, a woman with 20 years of experience and perpetually tired eyes, was barking orders into a phone, her voice tight with a strain Elara had never heard before.
Multiple casualties?
How many? Oh, God. Okay. Yes, I'll notify him. Maria hung up and saw Elara standing there, holding the coffee like a useless offering. Forget that, Maria snapped, her gaze distant, already calculating bed space and resource allocation. There's been a bridge collapse over the interstate. A multi-car pileup underneath. They're saying dozens of injured. Maskell Protocol. Level 1. Alara's blood went cold. Maskell. Mass Casualty Incident. The words were a key, unlocking a part of her she had kept chained in the deepest part of her mind. The tremor in her hand stilled. The ache in her leg vanished. The air, which had felt heavy and oppressive, now felt thin, sharp, electric with purpose. Dr. Vance strode out of his office, his face flushed with a mixture of excitement and panic. This was his chance to be a hero, a general commanding his troops. "What's the situation, Maria?" "Bridge collapse, Doctor. First wave of ambulances is 5 minutes out. They're reporting crush injuries, multiple traumatic amputations, severe head trauma." Vance puffed out his chest. "All right, people, listen up. This is what we trained for," he shouted, his voice a little too loud, a little too shrill. "I want all non-essential personnel out of the ER now. Residents, with me. We'll set up triage in the ambulance bay. Nurses, prepare all trauma suites. Evans." He finally saw her, standing frozen. "What are you still doing here? I thought I told you to get out. This is for real doctors and nurses, not students. Go make more coffee. A lot of it. That's something even you can't screw up." The room went silent, save for the drumming rain and the distant, rising scream of approaching sirens. Everyone looked at Alara. The humiliation was absolute, public. She stood there, the small cup of expensive coffee in her hand. The rich, warm smell of it seemed like a mockery. Alara didn't leave. She didn't make a sound. She simply placed the coffee cup carefully on the corner of the nurse's station, her movements unnervingly calm. She turned her head and looked at Dr. Adrian Vance. For the first time in 6 months, she looked him directly in the eye. The air seemed to shift. The person looking at him wasn't the shadow. It wasn't the timid student nurse. The eyes that met his were ancient, cold, and utterly devoid of fear. They were the eyes of someone who had seen hell and walked out the other side. Vance faltered. "What did I just say? Are you deaf? Get out!" The first siren screamed as it rounded the corner, its cry sharp and desperate. Alara's voice, when it came, was not a whisper. It was low, steady, and carried the weight of absolute authority. "No, sir," she said. "I will not." The entire ER staff froze, their collective breath held in a moment of suspended disbelief. They had just witnessed the impossible. The shadow had spoken back. For 6 months, Alara Evans had cultivated an aura of harmless incompetence. It was a shield, a camouflage she wore as comfortably as her oversized scrubs. The other nurses and residents had a running pool on when she'd finally wash out of the student program. They saw her quietness as meekness, her careful movements as hesitation, her downcast eyes as a lack of confidence. They didn't see the hypervigilance behind her gaze, the way she tracked every movement in the ER, cataloging the location of every crash cart, every intubation kit, every bag of O-negative blood. They mistook discipline for timidity. Dr. Vance, in particular, seemed to thrive on her submission. He was a predator who could scent weakness, and Alara projected it like a perfume. He'd once made her re-sterilize an entire tray of instruments because he claimed to have seen a smudge, a process that took her 2 hours while he regaled the residents with a story about his latest yachting trip. Another time, he'd accidentally knocked a full bedpan from her hands in the middle of the crowded nurses' station, tutting about her clumsiness as she knelt to clean the foul mess, her face burning with a shame so profound it was physically painful. Each insult, each small act of cruelty was a stone she placed on a scale inside her, a scale that was rapidly tipping. Today had been no different. Before the coffee incident, there had been the matter of Mrs. Gable in bed 5. The elderly woman had come in with shortness of breath and a history of heart failure. Her oxygen saturation was dropping and her heart rate was erratic. Vance, after a cursory listen with his stethoscope, had diagnosed a simple fluid overload and ordered a heavy dose of Lasix, a diuretic. Alara, while checking the patient's vitals, had noticed something else. A subtle friction rub when the patient breathed, a sound as faint as dry leaves skittering on pavement. It was a classic sign of pericarditis, inflammation of the sac around the heart. Giving a powerful diuretic in that situation could be catastrophic, causing a dangerous drop in blood pressure and potentially leading to cardiac tamponade, a condition where fluid compresses the heart until it can no longer beat. She had approached Dr. Vance while he was charting, her heart pounding with the anxiety of confrontation. "Excuse me, doctor," she'd whispered, her eyes on the floor. "Regarding Mrs. Gable, I thought I heard a pericardial friction rub. Perhaps we should consider an ECG and an echo before administering the Lasix." Vance hadn't even looked at her. He'd let out a short, derisive laugh. "You thought you heard? You, the student nurse who can barely take a blood pressure without her hands shaking? It's pulmonary edema, Evans. Textbook. Now, are you going to stand there whispering sweet nothings about what you thought you heard? Or are you going to do your job and fetch me that coffee?" Dismissed, she had retreated. But she hadn't given up. She'd found Maria, the veteran charge nurse, and quietly voiced her concern. "I'm probably wrong, but..." With her history, Maria, unlike Vance, knew that experience sometimes whispered truths that textbooks shouted over. She gave Alara a long, searching look, then nodded curtly. Without a word to Vance, Maria had grabbed a portable ECG machine and run a quick trace on Mrs. Gable. The result showed widespread ST elevation, a telltale sign of pericarditis. Maria had immediately paged cardiology, cancelled the Lasix order, and administered the correct anti-inflammatory medication. When Vance eventually noticed, Maria had simply said, "Her ECG was ambiguous. I took a precaution." She never mentioned Alara. It was a small act of protection, a quiet acknowledgement that Alara was not as useless as she seemed. Vance, seeing the patient stabilize, had simply grunted and taken credit. "Good catch, Maria. Always pays to double-check these things. That's why I have you." Alara had watched the exchange from the doorway, a silent observer. The injustice was a familiar, bitter taste. It was the same helplessness she'd felt when politicians on the news denied the existence of the very operations she had bled for. It was the same erasure of truth, the same arrogant claim to a victory won by others. Now, with the Maskell alarm blaring, that familiar bitterness was burning away, replaced by a cold, clear focus. The approaching sirens were a countdown. 5 minutes. 4. The ER doors burst open, but it wasn't an ambulance. It was a police officer, his face pale and spattered with rain. "We need help out there," he yelled, his voice cracking. "The rigs can't get through the wreckage. People are trapped. There are kids." Vance was frozen for a split second, his heroic script short-circuiting. His authority was confined to these sterile walls. The field was a different world, one of mud and rain and chaos he couldn't control. We have to wait for the paramedics to bring them in. That's the protocol," he stammered. "They'll be dead by then," the officer shot back. It was in that moment of hesitation, that fracture in Vance's composure, that Alara moved. She strode to the main supply closet, her limp gone, replaced by a gait that was pure purpose. She grabbed a large, empty supply bag. Her movements were a blur of efficiency. She began to fill it, her hands flying over the shelves. Into the bag went battle dressings, tourniquets, not the cheap plastic ones, but the proper windlass-style cats, chest seals, decompression needles, 14 gauge, a laryngoscope, and a set of ET tubes, saline locks, IO drill, suture kits. Everything she grabbed was specific, chosen with a knowledge that had nothing to do with her student nurse curriculum. Maria watched her, her eyes wide with confusion and a dawning awe. "Evans, what are you doing?" "Triage is compromised," Alara said, her voice still quiet but now sharp, clipped. "We can't wait for them to come to us. We have to go to them." She slung the heavy bag over her shoulder. It looked like it weighed nothing. She grabbed a handful of black triage tags for the deceased and stuffed them in her pocket, a dark, practical measure that made the other nurses flinch. Vance finally snapped out of his stupor. He saw her, poised to leave, and his authority, already threatened, felt like it was slipping away entirely. "Evans, I am ordering you to stop," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the suddenly tense ER. "You are a student. You are not licensed. You are not insured. If you step outside that door, your career is over. You will be a liability this hospital cannot afford." Alara paused at the automatic door, its sensor whining as it tried to decide whether to open or close. She turned her head slightly, her profile etched against the stormy darkness outside. "You are worried about liability," she stated, not as a question, but as a flat, damning assessment. "There are children bleeding out less than 100 yards from here." She looked past Vance, her gaze sweeping over the other faces in the room, the shocked residents, the conflicted nurses, the terrified junior staff. "Anyone with trauma shears and a spine, follow me," she commanded. It wasn't a request, it was a battlefield conscription. Then, without another word, she pushed through the doors and walked out into the storm. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and the rain hit her like a physical blow, but she didn't even blink. For a moment, no one moved. They just stared at the empty doorway, the sound of the rain and the sirens rushing in to fill the void. Dr. Vance's face was a mask of purple fury. He had been defied, publicly, by the shadow. Then, a sound, a clatter. Maria, the charge nurse, threw a roll of bandages to a young resident. "Go," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "Go with her." The resident, a kid named Ben, who Vance routinely terrorized, looked at his attending physician, then at the door, and then, with a surge of adrenaline and rebellion, he ran. Another nurse followed, then a porter, a small, ragged band, breaking protocol, breaking ranks, following a student nurse they didn't know into a disaster. The room went dead silent again. The only sound was the furious, ragged breathing of Dr. Adrian Vance. He had lost control. The foundation of his little kingdom had just cracked wide open, and he had no idea that the woman who had just defied him was not just a competent medic. He had no idea he had just insulted, threatened, and ultimately unleashed a person who was once designated as a force multiplier, a single operator capable of turning the tide of a battle. And a battle had just begun in his ER. The scene outside the hospital was pure chaos, a tableau from a disaster movie rendered in flashing red and blue lights and the relentless, driving rain. The elevated section of the I-95 overpass had pancaked onto the road below, a tangled mess of concrete, rebar, and crushed vehicles. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline, burnt rubber, and something metallic and coppery that Alara knew all too well. It was the smell of fresh blood on a massive scale.
The police officer who had run in led them,
A small group of rebels from the ER, toward the heart of the wreckage. "This way! We've got a school bus!" he shouted over the din of the storm and the arriving emergency vehicles. A school bus. Alara's heart clenched. She pushed forward, her movements economical and swift. The mud and debris sucked at her shoes, but her pace never slackened. The ache in her leg was a distant memory, burned away by the surge of adrenaline and purpose. This was her world. This was the place where the whispers stopped and the work began. They reached the bus. It was on its side, its cheerful yellow paint a grotesque counterpoint to the horror. The front was crushed against a concrete support pillar. Windows were shattered. Faint cries and whimpers could be heard from within. "Paramedics can't get their gurneys in here," the cop explained, gesturing to the narrow, debris-strewn gap that was the only access.
"Don't need gurneys yet."
"Need to stop the bleeding," Alara said, shrugging off the heavy supply bag. She knelt in the mud and unzipped it. The contents were laid out with a practiced, almost reverent order. "Ben," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. The young resident, who was staring at the bus with wide, terrified eyes, flinched. "I need you here. With me. You're my hands. Got it?" Ben just nodded, swallowing hard. "You," she pointed to the other nurse, a woman named Chloe. "Set up a casualty collection point right there." She indicated a relatively clear spot under an overhang. "Use anything you can find for blankets. Keep them as warm and dry as possible. Hypothermia is the enemy." Chloe, who had been frozen in shock, was galvanized by the direct order. She nodded and immediately started directing the porter.
Alara turned back to the bus.
"Okay, we go in. We tag, we treat. Red tags are immediate. Airway, breathing, circulation compromised. Yellow tags are delayed, serious but stable. Green are walking wounded. Black." She paused and held up one of the black tags. "Are expectant. We don't spend time there, we move. Am I clear?" Her tone was not that of a student. It was the clipped, precise cadence of a commander in the field. Ben, who had only ever heard her mumble, "Yes, sir," to Dr. Vance, stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. "Clear?" she repeated, her gaze sharp. "Clear," Ben stammered. "Good. Let's go." She crawled through a shattered window into the dark, cramped interior of the bus. The floor was now a wall, the seats jutting out at odd angles. The air was hot, humid, and thick with the smell of fear. Children were crying, some screaming, some eerily silent. A woman, probably a teacher, was pinned by a seat, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. Alara ignored the noise. She ignored the blood. She went into the zone, a place of pure, cold calculation she hadn't visited in years. Her mind became a triage flowchart. Airway, breathing, circulation, disability, exposure. "Ben, flashlight," she commanded. He fumbled with the tactical penlight she'd thrust into his hand. The beam cut through the gloom. She moved down the aisle, her eyes scanning, assessing. A boy with a nasty gash on his forehead, crying but conscious. "Green tag," she murmured. A girl, her arm clearly broken, but breathing fine. "Yellow." Then she saw him. A small boy, no older than 7, slumped in a seat near the back. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. A piece of twisted metal from the window frame was embedded in his chest, a sucking chest wound. With every breath, air was being pulled into his chest cavity through the hole, collapsing his lung. The telltale bubbling froth around the wound confirmed it. He had minutes, maybe seconds.
Ben, here,
Now! Ben scrambled over seats to her side. "Oh my God!" he breathed, seeing the boy. "No time for God," Alara snapped. "Time for medicine. Give me a chest seal." Ben's hands were shaking as he fumbled in the bag. He pulled one out. Alara took it, ripped open the packaging with her teeth, and expertly applied the vented seal over the wound. The one-way valve would let air out, but not in. "That'll buy us time. He needs a chest tube as soon as we get him out. Red tag. Now, find me the next one." They worked like that for what felt like an eternity. Alara was a machine of brutal efficiency. She slapped a tourniquet on a teacher's partially severed arm, tightening the windlass until the arterial bleeding stopped, ignoring the woman's screams of pain. "It's the arm or your life," she said, her voice devoid of sympathy but full of purpose. She diagnosed a tension pneumothorax in another silent victim by the distended veins in their neck and the lack of breath sounds on one side. And without hesitation, she plunged a 14-gauge needle into the second intercostal space. There was a hiss of escaping air, and the patient took a shuddering, life-saving breath. Ben watched in utter disbelief. These were procedures he'd only seen on video or practiced on mannequins. They were high-risk, invasive, and typically only performed by senior surgeons in a controlled OR. This student nurse, this shadow, was performing them in the dark, in the rain, on a bus full of screaming children, with a speed and confidence that was both terrifying and magnificent. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the chaos from outside the bus. "What in God's name is going on in there? Who authorized this?" Alara recognized the voice instantly, Dr. Vance. He had finally ventured out of his castle. He was standing at the shattered window, his pristine white coat already stained with mud. His face was a thunderous mask of rage. He saw Ben, his resident, taking orders from a student nurse. He saw the open supply bag, the discarded packaging from high-level medical equipment. "Ben, get out of there right now, and you!" he snarled, his finger jabbing toward Alara. "I told you your career was over. Now you're going to jail. You're practicing medicine without a license." Alara didn't even look at him. She was assessing a young girl with a suspected pelvic fracture. "Ben, I need you to hold C-spine immobilization. Don't let her head move. At all." "Ben, did you hear me?" Vance shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. "I am your attending physician. I am ordering you to step away from that patient." Ben was torn. His entire career, his future, was tied to the man screaming at him. But in front of him was a child's life, and a woman who, against all logic, seemed to know exactly what she was doing. He looked at Alara's face, illuminated by the shaky beam of his flashlight. It was calm, focused, a rock in the middle of a hurricane. Then he looked at Vance's face, contorted with rage and ego. He made his choice. "I can't, sir," Ben said, his voice trembling but firm. "I have to stabilize her spine." The silence that followed was more profound than any shout. It was the sound of a king being told his decrees were meaningless. Vance was momentarily speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "You're finished, Ben. You're both finished," he finally managed to sputter. He started to climb into the bus, intending to physically drag them out. Just as his leg cleared the window frame, a new sound pierced the night. It wasn't a siren. It was the deep, rhythmic whump, whump, whump of a heavy helicopter. A military helicopter, a Black Hawk. It descended from the storm clouds like an avenging angel, its landing lights cutting through the rain and illuminating the entire disaster scene in a harsh, brilliant white light. It didn't land near the designated ambulance zone. It landed with brutal precision in a small, cleared-out section of the highway, 50 yards from the bus, kicking up a furious vortex of wind and water. The side door slid open, and figures began to rappel down. They weren't paramedics. They were soldiers in tactical gear, moving with the fluid, lethal grace of special operators. An officer, tall and imposing with silver hair and a face carved from granite, jumped the last few feet to the ground. He wore the single star of a brigadier general on his collar. He strode through the wreckage as if he owned it, his eyes scanning the chaos with an expression of supreme, terrifying calm. His gaze swept past the fire trucks, past the stunned paramedics, past Dr. Vance, clinging to the side of the bus. His eyes landed on the interior of the bus, on the woman working tirelessly in the dark. His expression, hard as stone, flickered with something else. Disbelief, recognition, awe. Dr. Vance, seeing a man who was clearly in charge, saw his chance to reassert control. He scrambled down from the bus and hurried toward the general, puffing up his chest. "General, thank God you're here. I'm Dr. Vance, chief of the ER. The situation is under control, but we have a rogue student nurse in there who is endangering patients. I need her removed immediately." The general didn't even look at him. His entire focus was on the bus. He walked right past Vance and stopped at the shattered window, peering inside. The harsh light from his team's helmet lamps flooded the interior. Elara, sensing the change in light, finally looked up. Her eyes met the general's. For a long moment, the world seemed to stop. The sounds of the storm, the crying children, the shouting, it all faded away.
The general's gravelly voice was quiet,
But it carried over the din with the weight of absolute authority. He didn't say, "Ma'am." He didn't say, "Nurse." He said a single word, a name that was a legend in the shadowy corners of the world he came from. "Wraith," he breathed. "What the hell are you doing in a school bus?" The crisis inside the bus was a delicate, multi-layered thing, a Jenga tower of potential deaths that Elara was trying to dismantle piece by piece. The boy with the chest seal was stable for now, but his breathing was still labored. The teacher with the tourniquet was going into shock, her skin pale and clammy. The girl with the suspected pelvic fracture was a ticking time bomb. One wrong move, and a bone shard could sever her femoral artery. Time was not a friend. It was an active, malevolent enemy. Then, Elara's voice was a low, urgent hum beneath the noise. "I need a saline lock in the teacher's left arm, 18 gauge, now. We need to get fluids in her before she bottoms out." I've never done one in the field," Ben stammered, his hands slick with a mixture of rain and blood. "You have now," Elara said, not unkindly. "Clean the site. Find the vein. Be quick. Don't second guess." Her confidence was a transfusion, bleeding into him, steadying his hands. He moved to obey. It was at that moment that Dr. Vance, fueled by a potent cocktail of indignation and ego, chose to intervene. He'd finally managed to haul himself through the broken window, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping on the blood-slick floor. "I have had enough of this," he roared, grabbing Elara's arm. "You are relieved. Get out of this bus before I have you arrested for assault." The contact was like a lightning strike. Elara's entire posture changed. She didn't flinch or pull away. She went utterly, unnervingly still. She turned her head slowly, the beam from Ben's penlight catching the chilling flackness in her eyes. The shadow was gone. The commander was gone. What looked advanced now was something far older and more dangerous. It was the predator she had learned to be, to survive places he couldn't imagine. "Doctor," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any shout. "You have 3 seconds to remove your hand before I break your wrist." It wasn't a threat. It was a medical observation, delivered with the detached certainty of a diagnosis. Vance, for all his bluster, was a coward at his core. He saw the truth in her eyes. He saw the absolute lack of doubt. His hand recoiled, as if he'd touched a hot stove. He stumbled back, his face a mixture of shock and fear. He had expected tears, pleading. He had not expected this cold, lethal certainty. Who do you think you are?" he sputtered, trying to regain some semblance of authority. Before Elara could answer, the world outside was bleached white by the landing lights of the Black Hawk. The arrival of General Thorne and his team shifted the entire dynamic of the scene. Vance's ER chief title, which felt so monumental inside the hospital walls, meant nothing here in the mud and wreckage. Power had just arrived, and it wore combat boots. When Vance scrambled to intercept the general, desperate to frame the narrative, Elara paid him no mind. A new problem had arisen. The boy with the chest wound, the first one she'd treated, started to decline. The seal was working, but his breathing was becoming more rapid and shallow, his lips taking on a bluish tint. His uninjured lung was failing to compensate.
"His trachea is deviating,"
she said, her fingers gently palpating the boy's neck. "Tension pneumo is getting worse. The needle decompression isn't enough. He's going to arrest." Ben looked at her, his face ashen. "What do we do?" "He needs a tube. Now," she said, already reaching for the intubation kit in her bag. This was the point of no return. Inserting a breathing tube was an advanced, definitive procedure. Performing it here, in these conditions, if she was wrong, the boy would die, and Vance would have her crucified. "You can't," Ben whispered, horrified. You're not an anesthesiologist. You're not even a doctor." "He will die if I don't," she stated simply, laying out the laryngoscope, the handle, and the ET tube. "Hold his head. TC spine. Do not move." She was about to proceed when the general's voice cut through the air. "Wraith, what the hell are you doing in a school bus?" The call sign hit her like a physical blow. Wraith.
No one had called her that in 3 years.
It was a name she had earned in blood and dust, a name whispered with fear by her enemies and with reverence by her allies. It was the name of the senior medic for Task Force Orion, an elite unit so secret that the government officially denied its existence. It was the name of the person she used to be before a roadside bomb had shattered her leg and her spirit. She looked up, her eyes locking with General Marcus Thorne's. He hadn't changed. Same granite jaw, same piercing eyes that saw everything. He was the man who had personally decorated her for valor in a windowless room in Bagram, the medal itself so classified it could never be worn. He knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Vance, standing beside the general, was utterly bewildered. "Wraith? What is that? Some kind of nickname?" "General, this is student nurse Elara Evans. She's delusional. She's a liability." The general finally turned his gaze on Vance.
It was not a pleasant experience.
It felt like being weighed, measured, and found profoundly wanting. "Doctor," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. This liability has saved more lives with a roll of duct tape and a pocket knife than you have with your entire multi-million-dollar facility. She is the finest combat medic I have ever had the honor of serving with. Her real name is Captain Elara Evans, and for your information, she is, or was, a fully licensed trauma surgeon before she joined my command. The room went silent. Or rather, the bus did. Ben's jaw dropped. The conscious victims who could hear stared in stunned silence. The information was impossible to process. The quiet, clumsy student nurse was a captain, a surgeon, a war hero.
Vance's face
Went through a rapid series of colors, red, white, a sickly shade of green. That's impossible, he stammered. Her records. She's enrolled in the student nursing program. Because she chose to be, the general snapped, his patience wearing thin. She was medically discharged after her vehicle was hit by an IED. The explosion. It left its mark. She decided she wanted a quieter life, a life where she could still help people without the complications. She enrolled under a modified identity to ensure that privacy. Privacy you seem determined to violate. He took a step closer to Vance, his sheer presence forcing the doctor back. Now, I have a team of pararescue jumpers, PJs, here. They are the best in the world. But until they are in this bus, Captain Evans is in command of this scene. Your only job is to stay out of her way. Is that understood? Vance was trembling, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only the pathetic, terrified man underneath.
He could only nod,
his mouth working silently. The general turned back to Elara, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Captain, what's the situation? Elara didn't miss a beat. The past and present had just collided, but the mission remained. She slipped back into the language she knew best. Sir, I have approximately 15 casualties inside this vehicle. I have triaged 3 red, 5 yellow, and 7 green. I have 1 critical pediatric patient, 7 years old, sucking chest wound, now progressing to tension pneumothorax. I was about to intubate. Permission granted, the general said without hesitation. PJ team is inbound to your position. What do you need? Airway and surgical kits, chest tubes, IO access. And get this civilian out of my AO, she said, nodding slightly toward the shell-shocked Dr. Vance. The general gave a slight, grim smile.
he keyed the radio on his shoulder.
Havoc 1, this is Thorne. I need 2 PJs in the bus, stat. Bring the surgical kit, and send a man to escort a civilian doctor back to the hospital. He's interfering with the operation. The exchange was brutally efficient. It was a transfer of power so absolute and swift that it left no room for argument. Dr. Vance, who minutes before had been the king of the ER, was now just a civilian, an obstacle to be removed. 2 of the general's men, huge figures in tactical gear, appeared at the window. One of them looked at Vance. Sir, with me, please. It was a polite request, backed by the implicit threat of overwhelming force. Vance, pale and shaking, allowed himself to be led away, his career and reputation dissolving in the pouring rain. He cast one last, horrified look back at Elara. She wasn't looking at him. She was bent over the small boy, the laryngoscope in her hand. A warrior returned to her battlefield, her face illuminated in the stark, unforgiving light. She was no longer a shadow. She was the Wraith. The arrival of the PJs, the Air Force's elite pararescue jumpers, changed the bus from a scene of desperate improvisation to a highly efficient field hospital. They moved with the same quiet, focused intensity as Elara, their actions speaking a language of shared experience. They didn't question her, they augmented her. "Ma'am," one of the PJs, a young man with Santiago stitched on his uniform, said as he handed her a sterile surgical kit. "Chest tubes ready?" "Thank you," she replied, her hands already moving, preparing the small boy for the procedure. To Ben, who was still holding the boy's head with religious care, she said, "Watch this. You won't see it in a textbook." With a precision that was breathtaking to witness, she made a small incision, dissected the tissue, and inserted the tube into the boy's chest cavity. The moment it was in place and connected to a one-way valve, the boy's vital signs on the portable monitor began to improve. His oxygen saturation ticked up from 85 to 92. The color returned to his lips. It was a miracle of medicine, performed in the worst possible conditions. Ben watched, mesmerized. The woman he'd known as a clumsy, timid student had just saved a child's life with a procedure that would have terrified most seasoned surgeons. The gulf between the person he thought he knew and the person before him was immeasurable. While Elara worked, General Thorne coordinated the larger evacuation. His voice on the radio was a calm, authoritative instrument, cutting through the chaos and bending it to his will.
He directed the PJs,
Coordinated with the fire chief, and established a secure perimeter. He was a master of orchestrating order from entropy. Dr. Vance, meanwhile, was experiencing his own personal collapse. The two soldiers had escorted him not just out of the bus, but all the way back to the ER entrance, their silent, imposing presence a public humiliation. Every paramedic, every nurse, every cop saw the ER chief being frog-marched away from the disaster zone like a common criminal. He stumbled back into his ER, a place that was supposed to be his kingdom. But the atmosphere had changed. The staff who had once feared him now looked at him with something new in their eyes. Contempt. The story of what had happened on the bus had spread like wildfire, transmitted through the frantic whispers of the nurses and residents who had followed Elara out. "Where's Evans?" Maria, the charge nurse, demanded the moment he walked in.
She wasn't asking her boss.
She was demanding information from an obstruction. She's out there," Vance mumbled, trying to gather the shredded remnants of his dignity. "The military has taken over. It's a proper mess." "The mess seems to be clearing up now that you're back here," Maria said, her voice dripping with ice. The sycophantic residents who usually laughed at his jokes were suddenly very busy on the other side of the room, avoiding his gaze. The power structure had crumbled. Vance retreated to his glass-walled office, the one he called his command center. He sank into his expensive leather chair, the silence inside a stark contrast to the controlled fury in his heart. It was a nightmare. This wraith, this Captain Evans, who was she? How was this possible? His mind raced, trying to find an angle, a way to spin this. He could claim she had a psychotic break, PTSD. He could question the general's judgment. He could call the hospital administrator, his golf buddy, and have her blacklisted. His hand reached for the phone. He would destroy her. He had to. She had unmade him in front of his entire staff. But before he could dial, his office door opened. General Thorne stood there, filling the doorway. He had left the disaster scene in the capable hands of his team and had come here for one final piece of business. He wasn't wearing his helmet, and the full force of his grim, angry face was visible under the fluorescent lights. The two soldiers who had escorted Vance stood behind him, silent sentinels. "Dr. Vance," the general said, his voice deceptively soft. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The small office suddenly felt like a cage.
General,
Vance said, trying to inject some authority into his voice. This is highly irregular. That woman, Evans, she has a history of trauma. She's unstable. What she did out there was reckless. What she did out there, the general interrupted, his voice dropping to a low growl, was save at least half a dozen lives while you were shouting about liability. I pulled her file, the real one, not the sanitized version she used to hide from people like you. He tossed a thin folder onto Vance's desk. It was black, with no markings. Captain Elara Evans, graduated top of her class from Johns Hopkins Medical School, completed a surgical residency at Walter Reed, recruited into a special operations surgical team before she was 30, served 3 tours. She has performed life-saving surgery in moving helicopters, in flooded caves, and in the middle of active firefights. She was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions during Operation Nightfall, an action in which she held off enemy combatants with one hand while performing a thoracotomy on a wounded SEAL with the other. The general leaned forward, placing his knuckles on the desk. The air crackled. The injury that forced her retirement was from a bomb that killed 2 of her teammates. She dragged the lone survivor a full kilometer to an evac point, with a shattered femur and shrapnel in her abdomen. She came here looking for peace, Doctor. A place to be quiet. A place to heal. And what did she find? She found you. Vance was shrinking in his chair, the color draining from his face. The story was too specific, too detailed to be a lie. The whole world had just been rewritten around him, and he was the villain in a story he didn't even know was being told. The boy she intubated on that bus, the general continued, his voice now dangerously quiet, is the son of Senator Michael Hayes, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I just got off the phone with him. He was very interested to hear about the rogue student nurse who saved his son's life. And he was even more interested to hear about the ER chief who tried to stop her. Vance made a small, choking sound. A senator's son. It was a catastrophe beyond imagining. The senator and I agree. A full investigation into this hospital's maskil response is warranted, and a full review of your conduct. Personally, professionally. The general stood up straight. I believe the words he used were, I want his head on a platter. But I'm sure that's just a figure of speech. The general walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. You didn't just mock a student nurse, Doctor. You disrespected a war hero, and you did it in my presence. There are some mistakes you don't come back from. This is one of them. He opened the door. Maria and half the ER staff were standing right outside, not even pretending not to listen. Their faces were a mixture of shock, vindication, and righteous fury. They stared at Vance, their former tormentor, now exposed and broken. The general addressed one of his soldiers. Sergeant, please ensure Dr. Vance remains here until the hospital administrators and legal counsel arrive. He is not to access any files or make any calls. Yes, sir, the soldier said, stepping into the office. The soldier wasn't armed with a rifle, but his presence was as effective as a locked cell door. The general left, walking back into the main ER. He saw the faces of the nurses and residents. He saw the hope and the fear. He stopped in the center of the room, where Vance had held court just an hour before. Your colleague, Captain Evans, is a hero, he said, his voice ringing with authority. She did what was right, not what was easy. She upheld the highest standard of her calling. Every single one of you who followed her into that storm did the same. You should be proud. He looked at Maria. I expect your reports on tonight's events will be thorough and accurate. Maria met his gaze and nodded, a slow, determined movement. Yes, General, they will be. The unspoken message was clear. Vance's reign of terror was over. The truth would be told. As the general walked away, a new sound filled the ER. It wasn't the beeping of monitors or the wail of sirens. It was the soft, hesitant start of applause. One nurse started it, then another, then a resident. Soon, the entire ER staff was clapping, not for the general, but for the shadow who had become a wraith. The quiet student nurse who had reminded them all what it truly meant to save a life. And in his glass cage, watched by a silent soldier, Dr. Adrian Vance put his head in his hands and finally, utterly, broke. The next hour was a blur of controlled professional activity. The last of the injured were extricated from the wreckage, stabilized by the PJ team under Alara's watchful eye, and transported to the now prepared trauma bays at Northgate and other area hospitals. The rain began to subside, leaving behind a world washed clean, glistening under the emergency lights. Alara worked until the last patient was on their way. She moved from the bus to the casualty collection point, reassessing her yellow-tagged patients, applying splints and dressing wounds with a calm efficiency that continued to astound the hospital staff who had followed her out.
She said little,
Her actions speaking for her. With each life she touched, a piece of her own fractured spirit seemed to mend. The tremor in her hands was completely gone, replaced by a surgeon's steadiness. When the site was finally cleared, one of the PJs, Santiago, approached her. He held out a military-issue field jacket. "It's cold, ma'am. The general's orders." Alara looked down at her scrubs. They were soaked through, stained with mud and the blood of strangers. She felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion settle over her, the adrenaline finally receding. She took the jacket with a grateful nod. "Thank you, Sergeant." "It was an honor, Captain," he said, his voice full of genuine respect. He and his team had heard the stories about the Wraith. Tonight, they'd seen the legend in action. She was the last of the medical team to walk back to the hospital. As she approached the ER doors, they slid open automatically. The scene inside was different.
the chaos had subsided.
Replaced by a quiet, focused hum of work. But the biggest change was the way people looked at her. The whispers that had once followed her were gone. In their place was a profound, respectful silence. The staff parted as she walked through, their eyes filled with awe. Maria met her at the nurse's station. She held out a steaming mug. "Real coffee this time," she said, a small, weary smile on her face. "From the good place." Alara took the mug, her hands wrapping around its warmth. "Thank you, Maria." "No," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. For everything. For reminding us." She didn't need to finish the sentence. For reminding us what matters. Ben, the young resident, approached them, his face streaked with grime, but his eyes shining. "Captain Evans, I've never seen anything like that. The way you handled that pneumothorax, the intubation. Would you be willing to teach me?" The question hung in the air.
It was a simple request,
But it represented a seismic shift. He wasn't asking a student nurse for a tip. He was asking a master for guidance. Before Alara could answer, a woman in a sharp suit, flanked by two men in identical grey suits, approached the group. "Captain Evans," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "I'm Sarah Caldwell, the hospital administrator. General Thorne has briefed me. On behalf of Northgate Regional, I want to extend our deepest apologies for the unacceptable environment you have been forced to endure." Alara just nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It was rich and strong. It tasted like a small victory.
Dr. Vance has been suspended.
Pending a full board review, Caldwell continued, her eyes flicking toward his now empty, dark office. Frankly, his career in medicine is over. What we're more concerned about right now is you. We understand your desire for privacy, but we would be fools to let someone with your skills and experience walk away. We would like to offer you the position of director of a new emergency and trauma response program. You would have full authority to design the protocols, train the staff, essentially to ensure that what happened tonight, the hesitation, the failure in leadership, never happens again. Name your terms. The offer was staggering. From being a mocked student to being offered a directorship in the space of a few hours, it was everything she hadn't known she wanted. A chance to build something, a chance to teach, a chance to lead without having to carry a weapon. General Thorne emerged from a quiet corridor where he'd been on the phone.
He walked over to Alara.
His expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "The senator's son is stable," he said quietly, for her ears only. "The surgeon in the OR said your fieldwork was flawless. You saved him. The senator, he wants to meet you. When you're ready." He then looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a soldier or a medic, but as a person. That name, Wraith. We gave it to you because you could move through hell without anyone seeing you coming and leave miracles in your wake. I think you've been a ghost long enough, Alara. It's time to come back into the light. He gently touched the sleeve of her jacket. Pinned to it was a small, simple piece of metal. It wasn't the classified medal from Bagram. It was a simple captain's bar. He had brought her rank back to her, a quiet, public restoration. Tears welled in Alara's eyes for the first time that night. They weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of release.
The weight she had been carrying for 3
years, the shame of her discharge, the feeling of being broken and discarded, it began to lift. She looked around the ER, at the faces of the people she now knew she would lead. She looked at Ben, eager to learn. At Maria, the stalwart veteran who had her back. She looked at the symbol of her past, the captain's bar, and the offer of her future, a new program to build. She turned to Ms. Caldwell, the administrator. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, with no trace of a whisper. "I accept," she said, "on one condition." "Anything," Caldwell replied instantly. "The program is to be co-chaired by Nurse Maria Flores," Alara stated, looking at the shocked and grateful face of the charge nurse. "And our first hire will be Dr. Ben Carter, as soon as he completes his residency. Competence and character are non-negotiable." Maria's eyes filled with tears. Ben looked like he might faint.
It wasn't just a victory for Alara.
It was a revolution for the entire department. The culture of fear and ego was being dismantled before their eyes, replaced by one of respect and merit. The general watched, a proud, fatherly expression on his face. Justice had been served. A hero had been restored. He had done his part. He gave Alara a final, brief nod of profound respect, then turned and strode out of the ER, his duty here complete. Alara stood in the center of the nurses' station, the same spot where Dr. Vance had humiliated her just hours before. She was holding a coffee mug, but it no longer felt like an offering. It felt like a scepter. She was no longer hiding. She was home. 6 weeks later, the Northgate Regional Hospital ER was unrecognizable. The frantic, toxic energy had been replaced by a quiet, purposeful confidence. The glass walls of Dr. Vance's old office had been taken down, replaced by an open-concept command station where information flowed freely. At its center stood Director Alara Evans. She wore tailored black scrubs that fit perfectly, a stethoscope draped around her neck. There was no tremor in her hands as she signed off on charts or demonstrated a technique to a group of eager residents, Ben Carter among them. Her voice was calm and clear, her instructions precise, her praise genuine. She led not by fear, but by example, and the staff revered her for it. Maria Flores, her co-director, stood beside her, the perpetual exhaustion in her eyes replaced by a fierce pride. They were a formidable team. The Wraith Trauma Response Program was already a success. Alara had designed new protocols based on military field medicine, streamlining their Moscow response and running drills that were brutally realistic and incredibly effective. She had secured funding from a grateful Senator Hayes for state-of-the-art equipment and ongoing training. Northgate was on its way to becoming the top trauma center in the state. As for Dr.
Adrian Vance.
His fall from grace was as swift as it was complete. Stripped of his medical license by the board, facing multiple lawsuits, and publicly disgraced, he had vanished from the medical community. The last anyone had heard, he was working as a consultant for a company that sold dubious nutritional supplements over the phone, his charismatic voice now used to peddle snake oil to the gullible. The Rolex was gone, sold to pay legal fees. The comeuppance was so total, so poetically just, that the ER staff sometimes spoke of it with a kind of dark, satisfied humor. One rainy Tuesday evening, eerily similar to the night of the collapse, Alara was finishing her shift. The ER was quiet. She walked down the hall and paused outside Trauma Bay 3. It was empty and clean, the bed made with crisp, white sheets. She remembered standing in that same spot, a coward, failing to speak up for the little boy with the broken arm. The memory no longer tasted of ash.
It was a reminder.
A lesson she had integrated into her new leadership philosophy. Silence in the face of error is a betrayal. It was now stenciled on the wall of the training room. She took the elevator up to the pediatric wing. She stopped at the door of a private room and looked through the window. There, sitting up in bed and animatedly playing a video game, was the boy from the bus, Leo Hayes. His chest was healed, and he was scheduled to go home tomorrow. His father, Senator Hayes, sat in a chair beside the bed, watching his son with an expression of profound gratitude. He saw Alara in the doorway, and his face lit up. He stood and came to meet her in the hall. "Captain Evans," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He was a powerful man, used to commanding rooms, but in her presence he was simply a thankful father. "I don't think I can ever find the words to thank you for what you did." "I was just doing my job, Senator," Alara said softly.
You were doing more than that, he insisted.
"You were being a hero when no one else would." He gestured back toward his son. "He has your picture on his wall. He calls you his guardian angel." Alara's heart swelled. This was the peace she had been looking for. Not the absence of chaos, but the ability to create order within it. Not the silence of retreat, but the quiet satisfaction of a life saved, a future restored. She left the hospital and walked out into the cool night air. The rain had stopped. She looked at her reflection in the glass of the automatic doors. The face that looked back was no longer a shadow. It was no longer a ghost. The eyes were clear and calm, the mouth settled in a faint, confident smile. She saw the scars, the faint white line on her temple, the memory of the ache in her leg. But they were no longer marks of damage. They were part of a map, the story of who she was. Captain Elara Evans, Director of Trauma, a healer. True worth is not found in titles or credentials or expensive watches. It is forged in darkness, revealed in crisis, and measured by the lives you touch. It is a quiet strength that can be hidden beneath a humble appearance, waiting for the moment it is needed most. Arrogance may build kingdoms of glass, but character, courage, and competence are the bedrock on which true legacies are built. And for those who have been dismissed, mocked, or underestimated, know that your time will come. Be ready. The world is always in need of heroes, especially the ones no one sees coming.